How do you use your camera in manual mode? Hey, what's up? I'm Johannes, and on this channel I share my journey on becoming a better photographer and share all the lessons I learn along the way with you. If that is something that you are interested in, make sure to subscribe. In this video I want to talk about the manual mode. I will go over some camera basics that I think you should know if you want to make full use of the potential of your camera. If you want to use the manual mode of your camera, first you need to understand how a photo is created inside the camera. Light enters the camera through the lens and hits the sensor inside of the camera, or a film if you are using a film camera. If too much light hits the sensor, we get an image that is overexposed. If there's not enough light, we get an image that is underexposed. So our goal in photography is to get an image that gets just the right amount of light so it's correctly exposed. And to do that we have three dials that we can use to control the amount of light and the exposure of the photo. These three dials are the ISO, the shutter speed and the aperture. These three controls are also called the exposure triangle because those are the three things that control the exposure. The ISO is the light sensitivity of the sensor or the film. So it doesn't actually control how much light enters the camera, it just controls how sensitive the sensor reacts to the light that hits it. But when it comes to the ISO, we always have to make a trade-off. The higher the ISO, the more light sensitive the sensor is and the higher exposed the image is. But at the same time, the higher the ISO, the more noise is in the image, and that is something we want to avoid. Therefore, we always want to try to keep the ISO as low as possible. And how low, that always depends on the circumstances. If you're taking photos outside and it's a bright sunny day, you can go really low and use an ISO of, for example, 100. But if you're taking photos in the evening, you might have to go a little bit higher to 800 or even higher. And I recommend you to just test out the limits of your camera, because some cameras still do really well in high ISO numbers while others have lower limits. So just play around and try where the limit of your camera is so you can use it to its full potential. The aperture is the opening in the lens that lets in the light, and we can control how big that opening is. The bigger the opening is, the more light comes in, and the smaller it is, the less light comes in. And if we want to have the aperture wide open, we need to use a low f-stop. If we want to have a small aperture, we need to use a high f-stop. That's somewhat counterintuitive, but if you play around with it a bit, you really get the hang of it really quick. But the aperture does not only affect the exposure, it also affects the depth of field. The depth of field is the area of the image, or the size of the area in the image that is in focus. So if you want to take, for example, a portrait with a nice blurry background, you want to use a shallow depth of field. So you would use a small f-stop. If you want to take a landscape photo that is in sharp focus from foreground to background, you would want to use a higher f-stop so you have a larger depth of field. The third thing we can control is the shutter speed. When you push the shutter button on your camera, the shutter in front of the sensor opens, lets in light to hit the sensor and then closes again. The duration of time that the shutter is open is called the shutter speed. The longer the shutter speed, the more light actually hits the sensor and the higher exposed is the image. So the longer the shutter speed, the brighter the image. But when we use long shutter speed, there's also the risk of motion blur. That's why it's a useful rule of thumb to use a shutter speed of 1 divided by the focal length of your camera. Because the longer the focal length, the more exaggerated every camera shake is, so the faster your shutter speed has to be to compensate for this. So if you are, for example, using a 50mm lens, your shutter speed should be at least 1/50th of a second. That is, if you are using your camera handheld. Alternatively, you could just use a tripod. So if you want to photograph a moving object and you don't want any motion blur and you want to freeze that movement, you want to use a very short shutter speed. If we use longer shutter speeds, we can imply motion. A great example for that would be silky water photography, for example, when you want to take a photo of a waterfall and you don't want any single drops of water to be visible, but you want it to be one nice silky stream of water, you would use a longer shutter speed to create this effect. You can also use it with people. For example, if you photograph people that are walking and you use longer shutter speed, they will be blurred and you don't recognize the individual people, and it's just like this blur of movement that can create a really cool effect. These are the 3 dials that we can use to control the exposure. And before I said that we want to let in just the right amount of light and get a correct exposure. But how do we know that it is a correct exposure and that is the exactly right amount of light? For that we can use the light meter. You can find the light meter on the display of your camera or in the viewfinder, usually on the bottom. The light meter is represented by a scale that goes from -3 to +3. If the light meter shows us -3, it means that the image is strongly underexposed, so we will get a very dark image and all the shadows will be clipped and shown as just black. If it shows us 3, it will be the opposite. It will be very overexposed and everything will be very bright and white, and we use a lot of details in the highlights. So if we want an exposure that is just correct, we want to keep it around 0. That usually is correct most of the time. There are some scenarios in which the light meter is not correct. For example, if we take photos in the snow, the camera can get confused with all the white and think it's just light. So it will say that the image is overexposed, but actually it's just white. So in situations like these, we have to compensate and play around with other exposures and see which one looks better. Alternatively, you could also use the histogram, but I will talk about that more in detail in another video. Okay, now we can bring it all together. How do we actually go about taking a photo? First, we set the ISO depending on the light situation. So if it's a very bright day, you could use a small ISO of like 100. If you're in the shadow, you could use a little bit higher ISO of maybe 400. If it's in the evening, you could use 800 or even higher. Next, you need to decide what effect you want to create in the photo. For example, if you want to freeze movement with a very short shutter speed, you need to adjust the shutter speed next. If you don't care much about the shutter speed and it's more important to you that your landscape photo is in sharp focus all through the image, then you would want to adjust the aperture first. Now in the third step, you adjust the value that you haven't adjusted yet. So if in the second step you adjusted the shutter speed, you now adjust the aperture. If in the second step you adjusted the aperture, you now adjust the shutter speed. And when doing that, you want to try to get the light meter to be around 0 to get a correctly exposed image. If the environment is too bright and there's just too much light for you to achieve the effect that you want, for example, if you want to take a photo of a waterfall and create a silky water effect, but it's just too bright so you can only use a shorter shutter speed or the image is overexposed, then you could use an ND filter. An ND filter is something like sunglasses for your camera. You put it on the lens of your camera, it just makes the image a bit darker so you can use longer exposures or wider apertures even in bright situations. If things like silky water photography are something that you're interested in, you should definitely invest in an ND filter. It's very useful. Also, if you are a filmmaker and are into cinematography, you could also use a variable ND filter, so you can adjust the amount of light that enters the camera, so you can stick to the 180 rule and still control the aperture and have the aperture that you want. Now you know everything you need to know to use the manual mode of your camera. To make it a little bit more clear and easy, I want to show you 2 little exercises that you can use to practice taking photos in the manual mode. For the first exercise, I want you to go through your house and get 3 small items. You could use anything you like apples, action figures, pencils, water bottles, whatever you have, and put them on a table or on the floor with maybe 30 centimeters or about 1 foot between the objects. Next, I want you to take a camera and place it on one end of the 3 items so that all the items are in the frame at different distances from the camera. Now, focus on the object in the middle and just play around with different apertures. Start with a very wide aperture and you will see that the object in the middle will be in focus and the other 2 objects will be out of focus and blurry. And the smaller the aperture gets, or the higher the f-stop gets, the more sharp the other objects will be. Next, place a bowl of water in the sink and open the tap so there's just a tiny trickle of water that hits the bowl. Now take your camera and try to photograph the drops hitting the water. First, use a longer shutter speed. You might want to use a tripod if you have one for this to avoid just getting a shaky image. Now use faster and faster shutter speeds and just see what happens. You will see that the slower the shutter speed, the more blurry or silky the water will look. And the faster the shutter speed, the more you can see individual drops. And if you use a very fast aperture, maybe 1/500th of a second, you will see that you can really see every single water drop. The best way to understand something is always to try it yourself. So do these exercises and everything will be much clearer and easier for you. If you found this video helpful, hit the like button, it really helps a lot, and subscribe if you haven't already. And I see you guys in the next video.